Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Saturday session. Dr. Anand, today we are going to have a session on the geopolitics and security of submarine cables. Dr. Anand is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He had also coincidentally completed his PhD and Masters in Geopolitics and International Relations from Manipal Academy of Higher Education itself. He is currently also the coordinator of the department's China Studies Center and Northeast Studies Center. His doctoral thesis was on China's strategic culture and also involved field visits to China. Dr. Anand is the author of China's space capabilities and has published several book chapters and research articles. Dr. Anand worked with BEML and Kolar Goldfields, which are India's defense public sector companies. Dr. Anand has an engineering background. Dr. Anand, we are very much interested and excited to listen to you on the strategic importance of the submarine cables and how geopolitics and security play a role. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you. My big thanks to JanyuTech for giving me this opportunity to interact with, I think, some of the best minds in India, because it is very important for India's national security as well as its stature in the international system to have a company like JanyuTech come up with pioneering innovations and help India push forward and achieve its strategic objectives. I will just start to share my presentation now. So in today's Saturday talk, I will try to give some information about the geopolitics and security of submarine cable. I should say at the outset that this is a very under-researched type of an area. Because of this, there is a need for more understanding. There is a need for more discourse to be generated on this, because India is a country as an information technology powerhouse is very much dependent on its information security, and a lot of it actually rests on the fate of these submarine cables. So I will straight away go to what these submarine cables entail. So submarine cables are basically, in today's terms, optic fiber cables, which are laid down in the international seabed. And what they do is they connect continents with each other, regions with each other. And by doing so, they become part of globalization. In fact, you can see that the way the globalization has picked up, there is a lot of contribution which has happened from the side of these submarine cables. But what are these submarine cables? As you can see in the figure over here, in today's condition, they are optic fiber cables, and they are having several layers. Some of those layers will be conducting. They also have repeaters in between, so that's to make sure that signals go on unhindered. So there is some amount of power dependence, and because of that, there is conducting material here in addition to the optical fiber. There is insulating material. There are buffers. There are other such materials which will keep it safe from its surroundings, because as you know, the submarine environment, as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean, you can see that the visibility reduces drastically because the sunlight doesn't pierce through. And not only that, the ocean pressure also adds up to a significant amount. So it will be like, several elephants standing on your head when you are, deep in the water, or close to the international seabed. So it is in this kind of a setting that we are placing our submarine cables. So it is very important that these cables are properly protected so that they don't frequently get damaged. Right. So this is what I was saying. And these submarine cables are laid by ships through what are known as plows, which actually install these cables deep into the ocean seabed. But actually, if you look at the submarine cables, the two ends of the cables are actually located on the shores of the continent, and the areas where the submarine cables enter the landmass, that is known as landing station or landing point. So for any submarine cable you take up under the ocean surface, there are two corresponding landing points on each side. That's one very important thing to be kept in mind, because I'll come to it a bit later when we talk about the security of. Now, what do these submarine cables do? At the early phases, we'll just go into the geopolitical significance here. If you look at the submarine cable, as I told you, every submarine cable will have the cable section which goes underwater and it is connected to the landing station. And from there, it is actually connected to the cable networks which are there in the continental part of the world. Whether it can be regional, it can be national, it can be local. So if you look at the world today, there are several of them. I think close to around 500 main submarine cables are there existing today. Now, how have these evolved? Now, the submarine cables have a very interesting history. Their rise is almost simultaneous of the information revolution itself. That revolution was first started off with the telegraph in the mid 19th century, and with the advent of the telegraph, if you look at it, the telegraph actually was invented in the Western world, and the Western countries were the colonial powers, and the colonial powers had territories and stakes across the world, not just restricted to Europe. Yes, so there was an urgent need for them to communicate with their colonies. So London would like to communicate almost instantaneously with New Delhi, right, or with the United States, its allies. So it's not just with respect to its colonies, but also its allies. They required a need to communicate fast, because otherwise we know that the communication would have to pass through, on horseback or on railway tracks and all those kind of things. So with the invention of the telegraph, it became important that it is not just contained within the continental landmass, but it also extends outside. And at that point of time, there was no wireless technology. So the only technology through which you can send information was through wire. And they used these copper wires, sheath copper wires. They laid it across the oceans and connected it to their colonies, and they connected it to their allied region. So it is not a coincidence that the late 19th century is the time of glory of Great Britain, and they were the pioneers when it came to submarine cable. The first submarine cable was laid in 1850 between the English and the French in the English Channel, and later on it was scaled up, and the first ever transcontinental cable was established in 1858 between the UK and the United States. And from then onwards, you see that almost all these major powers, colonial powers, they tried to replicate this. And it was actually not just happening in the transatlantic. Later on, during the 19th century itself, it started happening in the Pacific Ocean itself, because Japan as a power was rising. America as a Pacific power was rising. The Americans actually got a bit annoyed because the entire transatlantic Mediterranean region was controlled by the British when it comes to submarine cable. So they tried to build their stronghold in the Pacific by building their own cable networks over there. The Japanese learned from them. The Japanese were a pre-modern or a pre-industrial revolution society. And when they got exposed in the late 19th century to the Americans and the Western technology, they immediately took it. Within 10-15 years, they created a modern military machinery, industrial machinery, which could compete with the rest of the Western world. And submarine cables was one of their major agendas. And they also started establishing the submarine cables in the Pacific. Now, later on, we see that during the world wars, the submarine cables played a very important role in terms of communication between allies, especially the transatlantic theater between the United States and Europe. Later on, during the Cold War, the same happened. But what happened in between is that with the advent of the Cold War, we know that all of you are aware of the space age, which evolved after the 1950s. And with the advent of the space age, there was the evolution or the origin of the satellite technology and the wireless technology. So slowly, wireless technology started taking over. Now, it was not just telegraph, it was also telephone. So in addition to the electrical signals, there was also voice communication, which was transferred. And slowly after that, the television coming into the picture, you have the audio-visual mode of transfer as well. And this came at the time when the satellites or the space age was dominant. So the undersea cables saw one of their darker days during that period. But it all turned and brought back the prominence of the submarine cables in the late part of the Cold War during the 1980s when optic fiber cables were introduced, because until then it was copper cables. Now when optic fiber cables were introduced, what happened is that the ability to transfer huge volume of data information became possible, which was not possible at that point of time with the space technology, because there was very limited number of space powers and limited number of satellites. So now the submarine cables came back and re-established their days of glory, and they became the most dominant means of information communication technology. And 90s, we know what happened. 90s was the era of the internet, and this internet basically, as all of us know, has now united the entire world. The whole concept of the world as a global village is now becoming a reality because of the internet. Anybody knows what is happening in the rest of the world because of the internet. We are separated by several hundreds of kilometers, but we are talking at the speed of light. So these are all possible because of the internet. And more than 90%, close to 95% or even more of the global internet traffic goes through these submarine cables which are under the sea. That is the condition now. So that can tell you what is the significance today of these submarine cables. They play a very important role in. Now let me go to the threat part to submarine cables. Now, because we know now that the submarine cables are so much of a significant to not just nation states or companies, but even our own daily lives, how can we bank on them? What is the security? That becomes a major question. And scholars have looked at this from various perspectives as to whether, there are two basic threats here. One is the physical threat. The other is the non-physical threat to the cables. Another way of looking at it is that there are threats which are non-deliberate, and then there are the threats which are deliberate. We look at all these four categories now. First, let us look at the physical security of these submarine cables. Now, as I have mentioned before, I have shown you before how the cables actually look like. The cables are designed for the safety of working in that particular environment, which is deep down in the international seabed under heavy pressure and those circumstances. But the problem here is that submarine cables by themselves can't suddenly start out in the deep sea or in the international seabed. There is a transition, right? From the coast to the beach to the shallow waters, it has to go into the deeper waters and then finally into the international seabed, right? So there is a transition period here between the landing station and the international seabed. Now, this is exactly an area where there is a huge problem, because if you look at it, this is exactly the area what in the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea is designated as territorial waters, which is around a dozen nautical miles away from our coast, and then further the exclusive economic zone, which is around 200 nautical miles away from our coast. These are the areas where the main human activities happen in the sea or near the coast. So you have oil rigs there, you have fishing activities there, you have ships coming, dropping their anchor and going back, you have several ports happen there. You can see a huge amount of activity happening in the coastal regions of the world. And there is no way in which the submarine cables can bypass these coastal regions. So what happens is that these submarine cables will become a victim of a lot of these human activities. Like for instance, dropping of anchor. As you can see in the figure, it contributes to around 1/4 of the damages which is done to a submarine cable. Because anchors are very heavy things and they have the inherent ability to destroy the submarine cable. Another important thing is that, a very unlikely thing, that is sharks. Marine organisms like sharks can come and bite and chew up these the cables and the linings and all those kind of things. So that is another threat. But that's again a little bit of a minor threat. Fishing activities, yes, definitely it's a huge thing. All these boats dropping anchors and creating issues. These are all done not with the intent of destroying or damaging these cables. Most of the times it has been done without knowledge of what has happened. But there are certain forces which is beyond the control of man, as you're aware of undersea earthquakes and tsunamis. And in 2019 it happened because of an undersea earthquake which generated tsunami. So because of this tectonic shifts, there is every possibility of these cables getting cut. So you can't help it. The other one can be helped by using proper regulations and things like that. Then comes the issue of the deliberate aspect. There are ways in which you can deliberately target these things. And it is a fact that submarine cables, even though they create a sense of interdependence among the rest of the world, there have been efforts in the past to physically destroy these submarine cables. Several times it has been done. It has been done even in the 19th century when some of the first submarine cables were laid. During the Pacific War, the Chileans tried to cut off the submarine cable from Peru, that is from Lima to San Francisco. So what happened is that during the First World War, the British actually cut the submarine cables, transatlantic submarine cables of the Germans, all except one. And why did they leave this one thing? Because they then utilize that information which is passing through that cable to understand what the Germans were planning. And this led to the discovery of what is known as the Zimmermann telegram. And this Zimmermann telegram is a historically important telegram. It is actually a plan hatched by the Germans, right, to ask the support of Mexico in case the United States enters war against Germany, so that the United States can be given a counteroffensive through Mexico, their neighbor. So the discovery of that actually made the United States more paranoid and further understood or make them understand that they have to enter into the First World War. So that significant what we are talking about. Now we move into another aspect, which is the indirect way of attacking submarine cables. And this one, there is no chopping of the submarine cable. There is no cutting of the submarine cable involved. You are just trying to infer what is going through. You are not interested in the hardware. You are interested in the information flow. You're just monitoring, snooping on the information which is going through. This is a part of intelligence activity. Now, with the end of the Cold War, with the Western countries having basically no threat from the rest of the world of anybody coming to take away the control over submarine cables, they were at ease. But even then, they were still suspicious. And this is what was leaked out during the Edward Snowden revelations of 2010s. If you remember, Edward Snowden, the former NSA employee, he leaked out a series of documents which spoke about how the United States spied on not just its enemies or perceived enemies, but also its allies. And it also revealed how the United States actually spied on the submarine of other countries or going to other countries, and using that to extract the information and see how those countries are thinking, how even your friends are thinking about it. And because of this, at that point of time, countries like Russia, China, India, South Africa, that was a time when they came together, called BRICS. They thought of bringing or creating a new submarine cable network of their own, so that won't be controlled by the Americans and the Westerners, and that won't be used against them. But somehow it hasn't taken off, because by that time, a lot of things happened across the world, and this solidarity among BRICS countries today, it's very much questionable, because today we are talking about the Quad, the quasi-alliance between India, United States, Australia, and Japan. So BRICS is kind of sidelined now. But even in this new era of great power rivalry, we are talking about this indirect threat being the most problematic. That doesn't mean that a direct threat can be neglected, because if you look at what happened in Tonga, for several weeks or months, they lost their internet connection, which was their only connection with the rest of the world. And if you remember, a few years back, there was a cutting of accidental cutting of submarine cable connection towards Chennai, which actually strangled the internet connections in Bangalore, the IT hub. So you can just imagine how we can be at the receiving end, because India, as all of you know, as an aspirant IT superpower, and if in one day we have an information outage, you can just imagine how much this is a problem. So this today, in the cyber security terms, this becomes part of the critical information infrastructure protection. Or let me put it in a more straightforward way. Today we talk a lot about cyber security, but a lot of cyber security is focusing on the software, antivirus softwares and anti-malware and all those kind of things. But 95% of those information is passing through hardware. The internet is virtual. The cyber world is virtual, but it can't sustain itself as a virtual world without being rooted in the real world. And where it is rooted in the real world, it is through these submarine cables and the data centers and all those kind of things. So even when we talk about cloud computing and all today, it is not a cloud which is virtual. It is also supported on the ground by physical assets, which is why today, even in this day, geography still matters, territory still matters, control over physical things still matters. It's a lot like, the cash which we have. You always count on what is there in your pocket rather than too much depending on Google Pay and all these other things. So this is where we need to focus on. We shouldn't take our eyes completely off the ball here, and that is one of the things. There is a reason actually why this area is a bit understudied. Scholars refer to it as the three invisibilities, the three ways in which this submarine cable security becomes invisible. One, it is invisible because it is infrastructure. Because everyone focuses on the services and the products, not the infrastructure. Second, it is an infrastructure which is outside your visible area. It is located in the sea. Usually you focus on what is located on the land. And the third level of invisibility is that it is lying deep underneath the ocean, right? Where no human being can ever see it. Now, one last part which I want to bring in here is that when it comes to physical security or the cyber or information security aspect of it, a lot of the threat potential is not happening in the underwater area, because accessing the underwater realm is very difficult. You should have a good array of underwater drones which can go in, have the ability to withstand the enormous pressure over there and operate and cut the cables. But you don't need to have that kind of a thing if you want to attack the landing stations, because the landing stations are exposed, and it depends actually on the country how much security can guarantee or security can guarantee to the landing stations. There are some places in the world where the landing stations are just kind of neglected. Anybody can go in and do anything there. But of course, there are other parts of the world where it is totally fortified. So this is something which we have to keep in mind. And at that point, you can do all sorts of physical attack, cyber attack, and a hybrid kind of an attack. It's all possible. Now, let me bring in one of the biggest threats today, and that from India's point of view and from the current geopolitical scenario is that of China. So far, we haven't discussed about China. We have largely been discussing about the Western world. And there is a reason to this, because until now, a majority of the world's submarine cables are owned by Western companies. There are around 400 companies involved in all of this, but what they do is that because of the sheer cost of the submarine cable installation, so average one particular kind of a cable can cost around $350 million. That's a huge investment. That's difficult for one particular company to raise, so a lot of them come together. So usually the existing cables are all owned by consortiums. There are very few government owned cables for that matter, or cables which have some role of the government. It's very much private in nature. It's very much consortium style in its ownership. And from the Western world to, more importantly, China, you can just imagine how China would like to take over this. Today, if you look at it, if you can see on the figures, there are 5 or 6 major, actually 5 major Chinese companies which are owning undersea cables. They are the China Mobile, China Telecom, China Unicom. These are all the noted most important telecom players in China. There is the CITIC Telecom International and the CTM, which are based in Hong Kong and Macau, respectively. And then there is a Philippines-based company, which is actually having a lot of Chinese stakes. So again, kind of controlled by China. So these are the only companies today who are owning submarine cables. Now, so it doesn't look like the Chinese are big players. In fact, the world's 3 biggest players are Subcom, the American company, Finnish company Alcatel, their submarine wing, and then there is the Japanese company which is involved. Apart from these 3, others are all minor players. These 3 are the 3 most important players. But increasingly, another trend which is seen in this industry is that because in today's world, the internet is filled with content created and transmitted through social media. So a lot of these big tech companies, whether it is Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, all of these companies, they know that most of their information is passing through these cables, and therefore they need to control this. So they are slowly acquiring stakes in a lot of these undersea cables. They are increasing their profile in ownership in these, because bulk of the internet traffic today is composed of information which is valuable for them. And by this date, they actually control around more than a third of the bandwidth passing through this thing. So there is a lot more they have to cover, and they're trying to cover. And in the meanwhile, a new player from China is coming into the picture. And this player is HMN-Tech. Now, HMN-Tech is a company which has a history, a controversial history, because its parent company is none other than Huawei. Yes, the same Huawei which is today trying to become the 5G leader of the world. right? Because today the Western companies are trying to take out Huawei from the world telecom markets because they feel that they might come and take over the whole 5G market. Even we, for our own national security considerations, are keeping them at bay. And because of these reasons, this Huawei technologies, what they did is that way back when they were established in the late 80s, and by the 2000s, by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, they understood the relevance of data flows, internet, the need to control submarine cables, and all those things. And what they did is that they tied up with one of those very first companies which created undersea cables, the British companies, and took a lot of technical know-how from them, and they floated a maritime version of their Huawei company, telecom company. It was known as Huawei Marine. And later on, what happened is that when the United States became harsh on Huawei and China in the past few years, especially from 2017 onwards, when they started branding China as their formidable adversary or rival, and there was a kind of a zero-sum game now between them. What happened is that the Huawei went a bit underground and changed this thing as HMN Technologies, which is now currently owned by another Chinese company. But behind all of this, the main controlling actor is Huawei, and we know today for sure that the Huawei is not a complete pure private firm, because any big private firm in China should have Communist Party representation in their board. And to a certain extent, we can safely gauge that all these big private companies are by and large controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. HMN Tech is one of the leading maintenance firms of submarine cables, because as I told you before, everyone is interested in the submarine cable safety and security. So a lot of effort is being placed in securing these cables. So HMN Tech not just does service, it is also the one of the world's leading producers of submarine cables itself. And you know what that means. It is composed of electronic equipments. And the biggest use with Huawei and other Chinese equipments is that they may be having backdoors to the Chinese intelligence apparatus, so that they know what we are doing and what we are planning. And because of this reason, there is a huge information security risk from India's perspective, from the perspective of the Quad countries, with the HMN Tech becoming a major player in the submarine cable industry, in the manufacturing as well as in the servicing maintenance operations. Because if you try to do maintenance, you can have a global control over them, because there are few players relatively who can do such kind of service. And it is not just this. The Chinese are actually, as I told you, you require, if you want to do physical damage, you have to require an array of submersible vehicles, which has the capability to go down and do these operations. Today, the Chinese have these three, and there are more. These three are some of the major ones. And they have at least a dozen or so such kind of submersibles, both civilian and military. And again, the difference between civilian and military is very thin, and you can just guess which one is civilian, which one is military, because all at the end of the day is having to do some service to the military. Because in 2017, the Chinese passed what is known as the National Intelligence Law. And according to this national state, that all organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts in accordance with the law, and shall protect national intelligence. So basically, you have to work for the national intelligence gathering mechanism. So a lot of these submersibles, whether it is Shanghai Yongshi, Jiaolong, or Fandauche, all of them are actually given the cover of scientific submersibles. They are there to go deep inside the sea, undersea, look at the resources, look at the natural diversity, look at all sorts of fancy scientific data. But we are quite sure whether what they are going to do is only that or more than that. Actually, some of their activity, these submersibles activity in the Eastern Indian Ocean region in the past few years have just increased like anything. And this has raised a lot of concerns in India's national security circles itself. So they can basically go deep down, because some of them have even gone down to the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean. Right? So they can go where hardly anybody goes and do things which hardly anybody does. Please now jump to India. in the case of India. In India, there are around 5 submarine landing stations, and we have been very late in terms of, even though we have a big information technology industry, we have been quite late in entering into this field. A few of the companies today are venturing into the deep sea to establish the submarine cables, Tata being one of them, and the most aspirant of them being the Reliance Geo. Reliance wants to create a big network in the Pacific. So these two networks, called the IEX and the IAX, they are so with this initiative, India is trying to actually build its own net, and you can actually look at it from the perspective of this current push, which, as you know, even JanyuTech will be beneficiary of, which is the need to become self-sufficient here in terms of information security and information communications capability. And without, just imagine a situation where the submarine cables linking India to the rest of the world gets controlled by China. What will happen next, right? It's a very frightening thought. And perhaps this is one way in which we can also help overcome our insecurity by developing our own indigenous capability and becoming a player ourselves. We can't call ourselves as an information technology superpower without giving the necessary information infrastructure to the rest of the world. So it will help both in terms of our defense, our security, as well as our stature as a global power. So this is where I'll just leave it for you.
In the landing points, we have a security threat in the landing points. Is the landing points, is there a protocol, United Nations or international protocol to protect the landing points? Or if there is some mischievous countries, whether they can be using it negatively. Is there a possibility, or is there an international protocol to protect the landing points?
To be honest, I'm not sure about any international protocol for protection of landing points. Okay. In fact, what I understand is that a lot of the current understanding on how data is to be routed and all those things is largely understanding between the owners of the submarine cables, the way in which they strike deals with each other, and that is how these routes are actually created. As far as the landing points are concerned, I think to a great degree the safety of it is dependent on the host countries.
Okay.
How capable is the host country? Because in an effort to connect all parts of the world, all parts of the world are not like Europe or the Americas, right? So if you have a submarine cable in a less developed country, it is a landing point in a less developed country.
Yeah.
It is obvious that it is going to be very much vulnerable.
And countries which are prone to civil war, so yes, these are the countries which are risky countries.
These are very heavy risks which have to be kept in mind. Thank you. Thanks a lot.